it was kind of awkward because I was like, because it's the traditional, right? It's like admitting to my pastor that I'm doing this thing that feels like disobedient, but really there's like an obedience in the heart of doing it this way.
Hey everybody, this is Joshua Hopping,
And this is Angel Ford.
and welcome to Fractured Faith, a mosaic of belief. And we're here to talk about tithing. It's definitely one of those money episodes, huh?
Yeah.
Now, before we go, I want to kind of remind everybody that the podcast here, we're trying. The goal of the podcast is to rethink the way of Jesus through exploring the biblical and historical context for different church doctrines. And tithing is one of those church doctrines that get used a lot, and for good reason, because you have to have money to be able to do things, to have buildings or to take care of the poor or the needy or anything else. There's still a certain amount of funds that have to be happening. But there's a lot of difficulties that I would say, maybe abuse and struggles and emotions around it. So that's why we want to go ahead and talk about the money and the tithing issue. Dum dum dum.
Bum bum bum.
All right, so Angel, as our resident pastor, um, yeah, there you go. What is tithing?
Yeah, so tithing at its root is just how it's traditionally seen is the money that we as the congregation give to the church that we attend. Tithing that root being like a tenth of your money. And is that gross? Is that net? That kind of depends on your own convictions or how the pastor teaches, but traditionally it's money that you give to the church.
Okay, so how is that different from offering, though?
Yeah, so offering, as I understand it, is the above and beyond of what tithing is. So if you want to say like, oh, I give a tenth of my paycheck to the church, the offering is that 11 or 12 or however percentage of that you want to give above that.
Interesting. All right, so that's some good definitions. So I've heard those definitions before. Um, I'm part of me challenges this a little bit of that, and of course that's what we're going to talk about. It's going to kind of talk through
Yeah.
different ones. So yes, I think one thing is that the tithing, which comes from the Hebrew word for tenth, 10%, and I think in the Old Testament, there's a lot of references to, like, Genesis 14, that Abraham offered a tenth of everything he owned to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and the priest of the Most High Lord. Jacob and offers a tenth of his riches to God in Genesis 28, and then of course in Leviticus, the Levites, the Israelites are commanded to give a tenth of their provisions back to God, and a lot of times that's a tenth of their harvest or a tenth of their sheep, or everything that they have. Right, they're taking that tenth to the
Right.
temple. Now, what was the purpose of that tenth? Like, what happened to it after they brought it to the temple?
I feel like that's a pop quiz. I think like it's just sacrificed, right? Like if it's like there's like usually burnt offerings, or if it's like the flock and things like that, it's a sacrificial giving, so they don't get that back.
Right. It wasn't trying to trip you up, but I think you're right. Part of it was burnt up, but I think also it was used to support the Levites, right? So
Oh,
the tribe
yeah.
of Levi.
That that part also, right? Because in the inheritance, like when the land was divided up to all the tribes, like the Levites had nothing that they claimed as themselves. They were supported by the other tribes.
Right. And so, like, if you're a pastor on staff, for example, that's one of the things people talk
Hmm.
about, is that you're not working. Usually, if you're on staff and you're paid by the church, you're not actually having another job or another sense of income. So you have to be able to eat. You have to be able to, have a house and be able to, pay
Right.
rent and all those things that comes with being able to live. And so there needs to be income. So the Levites, the priests of the temple, they were in that same situation in the earlier days of in the Old Testament, and they need to have it. And so I think there's a little bit of that God sense of the practicality to the tenth. of where you got to
Yes.
bring it there for the priest to be able to, eat.
Right. Right.
um, so that and of course now we're not in the Old Testament, right? Things have kind of went
Right.
forward, things have kind of changed or whatnot. In the New Testament, uh, is there really this kind of commandment to tithe or this 10%? Does that come up again in the New Testament?
Well, Jesus does mention tithing, um, but it's not ish. Jesus talks a lot about money. He talks a lot about not serving two masters, all of that. He does mention tithing in the context of the Old Testament law. Um, but he doesn't necessarily say like, hey, keep on doing exactly this. So yes, ish.
Yeah, ish. I think that's the ish that kind of comes into play, right? Um,
Yeah.
'Cause
And I don't want to, dismiss like Jesus does talk about money and he
yeah,
absolutely does like talk about the heart posture of God above money. Um, but yeah, ish.
yeah, 100%. The fond passage is where he, holds up a coin. He's like, "Well, whose picture's on this? Is it Caesar's? Give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. Give unto God what is God." Um, you know,
Right.
or they come, they say another passage is, "Hey, do you pay your temple tax?" And he tells Peter to go fishing, and he goes and catches a fish, and he opens it up the fish, and there's a coin in the fish's mouth, which is so awesome.
Hmm.
I really want to have that
Yeah.
happen, right? It's like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
But he takes that temple tax and gives it to the temple, which I should actually tell historically at the first century, what was happening is the temple had a temple tax. This isn't something from the Mosaic covenant, but something had evolved over time. And so what it was the priest and Sanhedrin of Jerusalem and the temple requested funds from the Jewish people, or the Jewish people will send their funds from around the Mediterranean, because at that point the Jewish people had been scattered across the Roman Empire. So they're in Rome, they're in they're in Alexandria, Egypt, they're up in the kind of modern day Turkey, they're over in Persia and Babylon. So they're scattered, and so they would send funds back, offerings, and then there's also again that tax which was used to upkeep the temple. Herod the Great had
Hmm.
actually built this huge, massive temple, and of course there was taxes that was imposed on the people by the priests to be able to fund and build that. And so there were
Hmm.
those temple taxes, in addition to the taxes of Rome, which Herod and other Pontius Pilate and other different political leaders would take their taxes as well. So there was a lot that was happening on there as far as taxes, in addition to during the time of Jesus, I would say. In addition to, you do have people who would actually bring their 10% in.
Right.
Now, I think one thing we're talking about, like I said, Jesus talks a lot about the heart of money. Now, I do want to call out that the 10%, and is, I know that's the kind of a number that's used because that's tithe is kind of off that 10% of that Old Testament law. But in the New Testament, that 10% actually is not mentioned directly. Is that correct? Right? They don't have. I don't recall a verse that says you have to give 10%. Right? It
Right.
Yeah. Instead, I think there's verses, Second Corinthians, about being a cheerful giver, about
Hmm.
in round. Paul actually took offerings for the poor. So, if anything, I would actually say that the New Testament commandment is that everything belongs to God. So
Right.
it's a hundred.
Right. Well, and I was even thinking like in Acts with the early church, like there's almost this higher calling because it talks about like they're bringing all of their possessions together to help support and sell and distribute to the people who are in need.
Yeah, that's a good passage there. He's like, I gave everything to the place, right? So they brought everything,
Hmm.
they sold their property, they brought it to the place, and then they distribute it to whoever needs it. So there really was no, it wasn't 10%, it was like 100% they were giving back at the time, which is something, well, you know, I guess there probably is some churches that do that, I guess you would say, but as the most part, we don't do that, right? It's not like it's like, hey,
Right.
sell everything, go poverty, and give everything to it. Um,
Right. So really, that's what we're supposed to do. Like, I own a house, I need to sell it and just be a nomad.
yeah, and then Angel, you get your
If
gyps,
there's anything you get from this podcast today, it's sell everything.
sell everything. But that's that. I think, and now that we kind of set some of the scriptures up, right? Because of the places there is kind of this biblical thing, the Old Testament of a tenth. There's also the New Testament
Hmm.
about everything doing it. If we talk about modern day churches, and we're going, and that's where I think when you were talking about at the beginning what a tithe was versus like tithe and offerings, is I think
Hmm.
we can almost come into a very simplistic way of saying, well, 10% goes to the local church because 10% went to the temple, and then the offering
Right.
that 11 or 12%, which is a easy math. It rolls off a tongue. There's a logic to that, but I
Hmm.
also think sometimes that can be and it's not bad per se, but I haven't been around church world, I think, for a long time with different places. I've seen abuses of that, right? It's where
Sure.
people are like, you have to give 10%. I've actually been around people who have to submit their pay stubs to the church to be able to say, are you
Oh,
giving
wow.
of your net, or if not just what you get pre-tax, because they're like, well, the government gets their percentage of what you earn, so you should give God that earn. It's not what you actually get after taxes, but what pre-tax, and you get really
Right.
legalistic in that. I've also
Right.
said to say that you have to give 10% to your local church, period. And that you could never,
Right.
if you do anything offerings, anything above that can go to nonprofits and ministries. And I struggle with that, Angel Beach. I really do. I struggle with that. To me, I'm almost like, okay, I think God owns all of our funds, but I don't really, I struggle, and I don't, quite frankly, I do not give 10% to local church. I will give, right, probably 10 or 15% or more of my money to charity of some points. I was scattered around and I'm giving it because in my heart, I'm like, hey, this is God's money. And I'm like, where can I give it to? And it's not all going to the local church.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I land on. I don't know. I mean, again, I keep coming back to this as a resident pastor. If I was in your church, like what do you think of having the hard line between having to do 10% to the local church versus a portion and then scattering it to other nonprofits? Do you have an opinion on that, or is it more like open ended?
Yeah, I mean, so this is going to be me kind of showing my cards a little bit. Yeah, so this is where I'm a little more non-traditional than what people might expect. I used to give 10% of my paycheck. I used to do that years ago. It has been probably about 5 or so years since I've stopped doing that.
Oh,
Um, yeah, you probably weren't expecting that. Um, I found it kind of went too legalistic in my brain. I really wanted to be able to just give 10% and it be a whole heart offering, but this whole idea of like, you can't do it out of this idea of like, oh, obedience for God to honor it, right? Like I got so up in my head about it that where I was just like, I my heart wasn't in a position that could just like do it correctly is the best way that I could explain it. And I think it's because like money is such a scarce, like I have such a scarcity mindset around money that it was really hard for me to look at down to the dollar of giving to the church and not like calculate it, if that makes sense.
no, yeah, that makes.
I'd be like, oh, I gave 10%, so now I'm being faithful. Now I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, and it just became too legalistic for me. So I actually switched up how I give and looked at it more in like a spirit of generosity. Um, like, a lot of my time, right? And like being a youth pastor for years, I gave my time willingly, freely. I would spend coffee dates with some of the youth girls or uh give. like buy things for youth group and everything, and I would never turn in the receipts, right? Because that's usually what they say. It's like, hey, like your ministry has a budget, so if you buy anything, like turn in the receipts, and the church will reimburse you. And I just never, I decided long ago, I just wouldn't turn in receipts. I would give my time, I would give my money, I wouldn't track it, and I just wouldn't turn in my receipts.
Ah, gotcha. That actually I can resonate with that. I mean, because as I shifted over on place, because like a lot of people listening to podcasts out here, we shifting right because there was a time where I was religiously giving the 10% to the local church,
Hmm.
and then as I pulled that back, and I actually had found myself at certain parts of where uh, I didn't have money to be able to give whenever something came up. Like if my neighbor had
Hmm.
an issue or something like that, I didn't really have money to honestly to be able to help them out or to donate to these other different causes because everything was being tied up in giving to the local church. And so
Mm.
in some ways, like I said, I kind of backed off of that and I actually have a pool of money that I kind of we set aside for this God's money. And so that when somebody comes to us with a request, I can just I can pray about it and give that money away because it's sitting there to
Right.
be given, right? It's not sitting
Yes.
there to be used for fun stuff or whatever else. And I'm able financially at this point in my career to be able to kind of hold of that, in a little savings account basically, and then be able to
Yeah.
that out as need be. And that's led to some really fun things because it really is as something comes up on the place, it's like, oh yeah, I have something here for you, to be able to go with it. And there's that cheerfulness out of being have that ability to do that.
Right. And it really is that. Like, I could, give so many testimonies of how me being able to like feel so much freedom in giving to my ministry, just like seeing the fruitfulness of that. Because now we do youth group out of my home, right? And so something I really wanted to do was to make sure it was cozy. So every Wednesday I bake cookies. And my husband, before we had the first Wednesday at our house, he was like, "Hey, how about we just buy a basketball hoop? Because some of our kids like to play basketball. And now that it's sunny out, it's like, hey, why don't we get like a whole volleyball set for the backyard?"
Yeah.
And then for winter camp, right? Like winter is and Christmas time, traditionally tithes are just always lower in that season. And it was one of these like, can we even as a church afford to take the kids up to winter camp? And I went to our pastor and I was like, hey, whatever the difference is, like let me pay for this. And I remember he had a conversation with me. He was like, Angel, like, I don't want to put you guys in a bad position, yada, yada. And it was like the first time I had to admit to my pastor, who's also my boss, to be like, Joshua, we don't tithe. Like this is part of it. Like, let me just it was kind of awkward because I was like, because it's the traditional, right? It's like
Right.
admitting to my pastor that I'm doing this thing that feels like disobedient, but really there's like an obedience in the heart of doing it this way.
Right. And for my
But if I gave my 10% traditionally to the church, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And I don't know how winter camp would have happened otherwise.
there you go. And let me come back and say that her pastor Joshua is not me Joshua. We just share the same name. But we were
Right.
talking
Right.
about other people.
Sorry. Yeah. Different Joshuas.
But yeah, that's so awesome in that way, right? And it's being able to have that
Right.
freedom and that cheerfulness to be able to do it, which is so amazing. And to me, I think what you just said there really kind of brings out the heart of what I think God or Jesus and the Bible is talking about. Is that's why the New Testament really is about cheerful giver, or what Jesus says you can't serve God and man at the same time because money drives so much of our decisions. So much of our lives
Hmm.
are circled around finances because that's our food, that's our livelihood, that's your house, there's a lot of fear
Hmm.
and anxiety around making sure that you can provide and eat and feed. And especially now in here we are in 2025, we have a lot of unknowns in our economy. We have a lot of challenges going on. Prices of eggs, prices of goods are going up. And there's a lot of uncertainty there. So people
Mm.
get very much in a scarce mindset of trying to hold on. And there's really this upside down kingdom
Mm-hmm.
mentality that God's been able to say is like, hey, wait a minute, say, I got you. You know, the birds of the field, they're taken care of. The lilies of the field are being decorated and clothes. Let me trust me with this. and and so we there is a sense of God wants that heart of not just fully kind of ripping on there. And as you kind of open up and you are able to give away for whatever percentage, and I think at this point, as everybody can listen now, is that none of us, meaning, are not tied to 10% by any means. um but whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
give and however you give it, but there's a sense of that generosity of being able to say that we don't live in a scarce world. I don't have to hoard that wealth. I can actually be able to have that freedom to give it whenever the need arises.
That for individuals who, do tithe strictly that 10%, like I think that's great, right? Like God honors that, God blesses that, and if that's your personal conviction to do that, then awesome. Um, I think, humans from a psychological perspective, we're so black and white about things. And I think the struggle in things about tithing specifically is we're we really like to know what is the right answer and what is the wrong answer. And we can easily fall into this all or nothing, like if it's 10%, it needs to be 10%, and anything outside of that, like you're doing it bad, right? You're now sinful and out of obedience. Or we can fall all the way over into this other of like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. And, like, our way of giving is a slippery slope to just not give, right? Like, oh, well, maybe I don't need to buy the basketball hoop because God will provide another way to entertain the kids, right? Like, I
Right.
don't need to go out of my way to buy these things because God can provide. And, I don't actually have to give, right? And you're missing a component in each of those, right? Like the strictly tithing per 10%, and this is the only way. Like you're missing like how God is wanting to like move your heart in that conviction, and the I can just do whatever I want, I don't have to worry about it. You're missing the blessing that God is trying to give you by being able to work through you to bless other people.
That's well put, well put. And I think that's also a good transition to actually talk about the abuses of money
Yes.
and tithing, and that could go in
Hmm.
different directions. So I think he's in the church throughout last 2,000 years. There's cycles, there's ups and downs coming, and a lot of times that would be, as we see in Acts again, everybody lived together, everybody sold it together, everybody came in, and then as human history come on there. There was like this the church then started accumulating wealth. The Roman Catholic
Hmm.
Church, for example, is one of the wealthiest organizations on the planet. You have other different
Yeah.
organizations in America, Protestant and other denominational, that you have people who have, jet planes and, $1 million houses and cars and
Hmm.
stuff, and these nonprofits, these pastors and these ministry leaders that just have all this wealth. And sometimes they put a theology to it, right? This is where the rise of the prosperity doctrine is, where
Hmm.
if you give to God, if you put in your seed money in now, then you receive a blessing back from God,
Hmm.
hundredfold, 20-fold, whatever, and they put these numbers to it, and so they
Right.
want you to send in your checks to these people, and
Right.
um, oh, my heart, I have so many emotions around that, and in a
Yeah, yeah.
way,
It's gross. It's really gross.
it is. It's like I have to admit, I don't really trust a pastor who drives a Bentley. I'm sorry. Um,
Yeah, sure.
I can't do it. I'm like, no, I'm like, and this is not to say, and this goes back to the opposite side, is that you don't have to be, very, poor in having like no
Right.
food and having just nothing and living in dirt to be a pastor. And this is somebody I've actually had. My grandparents were pastors and they lived by faith and they had very little. And then when they got old and they were elderly and they were dying, they had like nothing and they didn't have a savings account because the churches that they were pastoring, they provided a parsonage for them or they gave them a meager salary, but they didn't offer health care with the churches. They didn't give a retirement
Mm,
package to them as pastors. They were like,
right.
give them just the bare basics. And a lot of times the money that came into the church was used to feed, the poverty and poor and other different, or get the lights on in the church building. And so, I see my grandparents go through this. Even when I was a former pastor at bivocational, it's like all that money that came in, you're sitting it out to the ministries, because you're
Right.
when you are a pastor, and Angel, I know this is equal. You just shared it. It's like your heart is for the people who you're pastoring, and it's not to
Right.
rich. And so you're giving this away, right? So anything that's coming in, you're trying to give it away, which means in some cases you're left with nothing. And
Right.
there's almost a sense that holiness is to be poor. And this is also kind of this the Franciscans, to kind of go back to the Roman Church. There was this reaction to the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church in medieval Europe. So Francis Sia came in there, and he like famously just stripped himself butt naked. I mean, completely just all his clothes off. And he's like, I belong to Jesus now. And he just walked off and just started like, following God.
Mhm.
And his followers would just go with like literally nothing, like just like a tunic or a cloak. And it was that sense of God's going to take care of me. And it was a reaction to the wealth of the church and all the different abuses of people taking all the money. And so there was that reaction back, and there's some groups of churches that still have that reaction. But again, I think that can lead to big its own problems. Like I said, even my own grandparents, and maybe that's my own baggage that I have on me, but I've seen that where people who give their entire life to ministering and pastoring in small little churches. I mean, I'm not talking about anything big. These are, salted earth kind of people. And yet they had nothing at the end, right? At the end of their life, they had
Right.
no retirements, no nothing. And it was just all because that was not a value of those churches. And then
Right.
then you see these big churches, and they're asking for money for their jet planes and their
Right.
cars, and it's just,
Right.
just want to throw up again.
Yeah, and I think it's so problematic, right? Like again, this human mentality of like the all or nothing, you either be dirt poor and you're doing it right, or you're this rich pastor driving your private jet and you're doing it wrong. And like finding the middle ground in here where like pastors do hard jobs, like we're the frontliners for so much spiritual warfare and spiritual care for an entire flock that God has put us in a position of protection over. And so it is hard. And like, how do you put a price on that? And do you put a price on that? And that's like such an easy gateway for the abuse, right? Like taking care of the pastors and maybe even like some pride and ego in there where it's like, well, I do so much, so I deserve, that Bentley. And I think there's like this constant heart check that pastors have to do to be like, okay, I do this hard work. I have a responsibility to care for myself. I do earn some type of income, but that doesn't mean I'm entitled to, a lavish life. But, if God does put us in front of a congregation that is big enough, then like where do we personally draw that line of being like, okay, I earn six figures and I use it responsibly for my congregation. Um, but it's hard because, money corrupts, right?
Yeah.
Like it's, money is just one of those things that equates like automatic power. And it is just such a corrupting tool that I think for the pastors that are in charge of big churches have to have a very strong connection to their walk with Jesus to be able to steward that responsibly.
Yeah, I would agree with that one. I think we're we blend in talking about tithing and money into that one. Is there's also, I think, churches have this responsibility for transparency, and being able
Yes.
to have that
Hmm.
transparency to the congregation. So if you are taking donations in, then you're able to be able to say, hey, these are our salaries. And I know that seems weird to be able to tell the salaries of your pastors, but these, you are talking
Hmm.
about nonprofits, right? It's like if you're a teacher, for example, and this is why I was on my local school board for a couple of years, your local teachers, you can actually see what their salary is. at least in the state of Idaho, because it's
Hmm.
public information that you're doing it, because the taxes that you're paying goes to pay these salary these teachers and the school administrators, so you can see what their salaries are. And so I am an advocate of the same
Right.
thing for pastors. And I'm all if you're especially the larger churches, so that again there's accountability happening. I would also say with that is if you are in a bigger church and congregation, that the church should be able to provide insurance, medical insurance, and even for, or
Hmm.
a retirement for the ministers as well as for everyone on their staff, not just the minister, the custodial worker, the child, the people they're paying, especially your salaried employees
Right.
of all levels, because they are, by working at that nonprofit, they are giving up an opportunity to work in another area to where they would make more funds. And I will also, and that would
Right.
also say that I think bivocationary pastors is also a growing thing, and I think it needs to be advocated and done, because when I worked, I was bivocational, so I was actually working full time at a job and pastoring, and there's a lot of struggles there, a lot of struggles because you're doing a lot of different jobs. At the same time, it did
Hmm.
allow me to be free to do what God wanted me to do without having to have the fear of the congregation. Like if they didn't give that month, I still ate. Um, but so there's a
Right.
freedom in that
Right.
sense, and there's other challenges. That's another topic for another day. But even being able to rejoice for those pastors, because some people say, well, those are not real pastors. And I'm like, no, yeah, they are. I'm like, come on.
Mm.
Paul, this is Jesus. A lot of these guys in the New Testament were bivocationary. They weren't just full time guys. So
Right. It would have been really nice if I didn't have to be bivocational, but that's just where we
exactly.
are. And yeah, I don't think it takes away from, you know, the the heart and the impact that you have in your ministry if you're not able to just be fully supported by the church.
100%. 100%. All right, so we are needing to wrap up on our time here. So to kind of wrap up, this kind of summarize. So tithing 10%. We kind of talked the history of that one. We come to the agreement that it's not really 10%. It's God has it all. Be cheerful. Whether that's giving to your local church,
Hmm.
was giving somewhere else, it's more about your heart stance, I would say, and not letting money control you more than it is about a
Right.
number or even to where you give
Hmm.
that deal. So I think that is a good one. Also, understanding that we definitely see that churches do have a need for it, and we're not going to begrudge churches and nonprofits from being able to ask for money, because there are people who need to eat. Those there's things that need to happen. Money is something
Right.
to keep the lights on. Gotta, if you want to come into a place that has AC
Right.
heater, you gotta take money. So at the same
Right.
time, is I think all we both have this caution tale of the abuses of that, either by nothing, by having that's not any more holy than having tons, right? And being aware of that riches and the struggles that comes with lots of money. This is what I think Jesus talked about. Is better, easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. So there is definitely a concern. So definitely interesting
Right.
topic.
And I think yeah, I think at the end of the day, like it all just, you have to point it back to Jesus, right? Like whether you are giving 10% or 20% or laissez-faire or letting your generosity and your heart posture guide you, or just deciding, you know what, I'm not going to do any of it at all. Like you need to be able to bring it to the feet of Jesus. You need to be able to be in tune with your personal walk with him and to be able to have those conversations with God and be real with yourself and with him and being like, whatever I decide to do or how to give or to not give, like, why am I doing it? Has God and I talked about this? And is there a spirit-led action behind what I'm choosing to do here?
I would agree with that. Well, folks,
We agree so much for this one.
yeah, we do. We do actually. That's actually kind of fun. this
Yeah.
one we definitely do keep on to, which is interesting. Actually, I was a little bit surprised because folks, you listening, we will pick a topic, we may throw some talking points out, but we're not actually talking through where we land until we actually get into the
Hmm.
podcast. So you get some real emotions and stuff in here, but it turns out that we both really do agree with, it is important to give. God controls your money, but how and where and all those details, just ask God.
Yeah.
Ask God.
Just, yeah. Talk to God.
All right, we are going long, so I definitely got to be able to end it here for you guys, folks. But thank you guys so much for actually joining us here on Fractured Faith. Make sure that you're liking and subscribing to the podcast so you can hear more of us every 2 weeks as we come to you with topics. If there is anything that a topic or a area that you want us to talk about, just leave us a comment and drop us a note on your podcast or on our Facebook where you see this, and we'll make sure we pick that up. But thank you again for everything. And until next time, be blessed and continuing to follow the creator into the darkness of the unknown.
Bye.